They said Africa only buys. They said Burkina Faso can't build. They were wrong. Out of the dust and heat, a factory has risen, not foreign-owned, not borrowed, but African-born. And from it came a truck that does more than move cargo. It moves a continent. It shatters dependency, it ignites pride, it rewrites destiny. This is not just industry, it is rebellion on wheels. So here's the question: if one nation can do this, what happens when all of Africa starts building? And who, in that moment, will dare to stop it? In 2025, Burkina Faso shocked the region again. Under President Ibrahim Traoré, the government seized control of key gold mines, declaring that Africa's wealth would no longer be exported without value. At the same time, local industry showed its first sparks, but Equipments unveiled an armored prototype at SISTEF 2025. While new factories for food and medicine began rising from the ground. And from China arrived convoys of armored vehicles and artillery, proof that the nation was rebuilding not just its army, but its industrial backbone. Overnight, what was once dismissed as a fragile state became a symbol of self-reliance. And the question spread across the Sahel: if Burkina Faso dares to industrialize, who will follow next? For years, Burkina Faso relied on second-hand imports. Trucks that had already served their time in Europe or Asia. Engines worn out, suspensions cracked, cabins rusted. These machines were never designed for African roads. Never designed for African heat. Farmers watched helplessly as their vehicles collapsed under heavy loads. Mechanics shook their heads, forced to wait months for overpriced spare parts. It was not only inefficiency. It was humiliation. The dependency built frustration. Every broken engine was a reminder that Africa consumed but did not create. Every missing part whispered the same cruel sentence: you cannot build. In 2022, that sentence was challenged. Inspired by a wave of nationalism, by Pan-African pride, and by the leadership of President Ibrahim Traoré, a group of Burkinabe engineers and entrepreneurs decided to attempt the impossible: to build their own factory. To craft their own trucks. No foreign investors. No corporate giants. No safety net. Only African minds, African hands, African will. They chose land just outside Ouagadougou. From red dust rose steel frames. From scattered equipment came assembly lines. Hundreds of young men and women, most of whom had never stepped into a factory, learned welding. Mechanics, design, logistics. They trained day and night, their eyes burning with belief. 1 year later, the gates opened and the first Burkinabe-made truck rolled forward. It was not a copy of a foreign brand. It was a machine born of African soil, built for African roads, powered by African purpose. Heavy suspensions. Reinforced chassis. Engines capable of surviving Sahel heat and muddy tracks. And most importantly, simplicity. No need for rare, imported parts. Local mechanics could fix it. Farmers could maintain it. Each truck carried more than goods. It carried a statement. With every ignition, Burkina Faso told the world, we will no longer wait. We will no longer beg. We can build. The impact was immediate. The factory gave jobs to over 500 citizens. Each worker represented a family, a community, a shift in destiny. With every truck sold, a supply chain of Burkinabe-made parts was activated: welders, suppliers, transporters, fuel providers. Universities opened training programs, linking classrooms to production floors. Parents who once feared their children would risk the Mediterranean began to believe in futures at home. One young woman said it best: before, I thought my future was in France. Now I build trucks in Burkina Faso. Her voice echoed through villages and cities. Dozens like her found dignity not in escape, but in creation. And the world noticed. Orders arrived from Mali, Niger, Togo, Chad. These nations, tired of waiting months for overpriced imports, turned to their neighbor. When pure trucks were 25 to 30% cheaper. No middlemen. No long shipping delays. Just African commerce, nation to nation, brother to brother. What started as a national project quickly became a continental signal. A message carved in steel: Africa is done waiting. Africa can manufacture its own future. Inside the factory, the ambition grew. Engineers sketched designs for electric models, hybrid engines, tractors, buses. Imagine it, an African electric vehicle. Built for African roads, charged by African sun. No longer a dream, but a plan. No longer a story of dependency, but of defiance. And so the factory stands today, not only as a building of concrete and machines, but as a symbol. Proof that even a landlocked nation with limited resources can write a different story. A blueprint that others can follow. A reminder that sovereignty is not given. It is built, piece by piece, bolt by bolt, truck by truck. The factory did not rise overnight. It rose from red soil, from calloused hands, from the belief that a nation could transform itself through discipline and work. Just outside Ouagadougou, steel skeletons took shape. Concrete foundations hardened under Sahel sun. And into this new cathedral of industry walked hundreds of Burkina youth who had never seen an assembly line before. They arrived uncertain, some barely out of school, others with no experience beyond farms and markets. But they carried something more valuable than expertise: hunger. Hunger to learn. Hunger to create. Hunger to prove that African hands could be more than cheap labor for foreign masters. Training began from the ground up. Welding, mechanics, design, logistics. Quality control. Older engineers, themselves self-taught, stood beside teenagers with sparks flying into the night. Every day was a classroom. Every mistake, a lesson. Every success, a victory not just for the individual but for the nation. And slowly, a rhythm emerged. Steel beams were cut and welded. Chassis were reinforced. Suspensions were tested against pounding roads. Engines roared to life under African skies. Young men and women who once doubted their future began to see it in front of them, in bolts tightened by their own hands, in machines that carried their fingerprints. The first production line rolled forward like a march. Not thousands, not yet. But enough to prove the doubters wrong. Trucks stood tall, rugged and unpolished, but proud. Each carried a stamp of defiance, made in Burkina Faso. The simplicity was genius. No expensive electronic systems that demanded foreign parts. No fragile components that collapsed at the first shock. Instead, trucks built for dust. For heat, for the unpredictable violence of African roads. Designed to be repaired by local mechanics with basic tools. Designed to keep farmers moving, builders building, soldiers supplied. And with every ignition came a ripple. 500 workers employed directly. Thousands more touched indirectly, welders supplying steel, drivers transporting components, fuel providers filling tanks. Food vendors feeding workers at factory gates. The economy that once bled wealth outward began to circulate it inward. Universities adapted. Engineering departments partnered with the factory. Students who once memorized outdated foreign textbooks now handled real parts, real designs, real machines. They no longer asked, "Can Africa build?" They asked, "How do we build better?" Parents who once feared for their children's lives as they risked the Mediterranean began to see another path. A path that did not lead to exile but to contribution. To pride. To dignity. One father said, "My son used to dream of France. Now he dreams of steel and engines in Burkina Faso." This was not just economics. It was social transformation. Migration slowed. Communities revived. A sense of national pride, long crushed under dependency, began to return. And the symbolism extended beyond Burkina Faso. Orders from Mali, Niger, Togo, and Chad carried more than contracts. They carried solidarity. They said, "If you can build, we will buy. If you can rise, we will rise with you." At regional meetings, leaders whispered of possibilities. A West African corridor of production. Parts made in one country, assembled in another, exported across the Sahel. A network of factories, each feeding the other, each strengthening the dream of an industrial Africa. Inside the factory, ambition expanded. Sketches of electric models filled drafting boards. Solar-powered assembly lines were imagined. Research labs were proposed, where Burkina youth could experiment with engines tailored for Africa's future. And in every hallway, on every wall, one phrase echoed, "We build." Simple, but revolutionary. For a continent long told it could not, those two words shattered centuries of narrative. This was more than a factory. It was a movement. A reminder that sovereignty does not only live in speeches or constitutions. It lives in the hands of welders, in the sweat of mechanics, in the roar of engines built at home. And as the dust settled over Ouagadougou, as trucks rolled onto Sahel roads, the world was forced to confront a truth it never expected: Africa is not waiting anymore. The trucks did not remain within Burkina Faso's borders. They carried with them a signal, a pulse that reverberated across the Sahel. In Mali, farmers who once waited months for foreign trucks found new options arriving from Ouagadougou. In Niger, construction companies replaced aging imports with machines built by neighbors. In Togo and Chad, orders arrived not out of charity, but necessity. When pure trucks were cheaper, faster to deliver, and better suited for African roads. And that was the turning point. For decades, Africa had been the dumping ground of used machines. Second-hand markets thrived, while dignity eroded. But here was a reversal. Instead of waiting for Europe or Asia to offload, nations turned to one another. Instead of importing dependency, they imported solidarity. The numbers told a story, but the emotions told a bigger one. Each contract signed between two African nations was more than business. It was a declaration: we trust you. We believe in your hands, in your skills, in your sovereignty. The ripple effect grew. Supply chains expanded. Local steel producers, transport companies, mechanics, fuel stations, all became part of an African network of creation. The profits no longer leaked outward to foreign banks. They circulated within communities, within families, within Africa itself. And pride surged. In Ouagadougou's markets, people pointed at passing trucks with quiet satisfaction: that one. It is ours. In university halls, students began sketching their own visions of future vehicles, not as dreamers but as future builders. In villages, children saw fathers and mothers wearing factory uniforms and believed, for the first time, that modern industry was not a foreign possession but an African reality. But the ambition stretched further. Leaders began to envision an industrial corridor across West Africa. Factories in Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, connected, complementary, co-creating. A part produced in Niamey, assembled in Ouagadougou, shipped through Bamako. Borders that once divided could now unite. At continental forums, the Pure factory was cited not as an anomaly but as a blueprint. Delegates spoke of a future where Africa would not only export raw minerals but transform them into finished products. Where the profits of cobalt, lithium, and iron would not vanish overseas but fuel African innovation. And behind the speeches was a quiet defiance. Because this factory was not born with Western capital or Chinese loans. It was born of self-reliance. It told the world that Africa's industrial age could begin without permission. And that idea unsettled many. Analysts in Europe wrote cautious reports. If Africa builds for itself, they warned, global markets will shift. If Africa manufactures, foreign dominance weakens. But in the streets of Ouagadougou, in the fields of Mali, in the dusty roads of Niger, the people had a simpler response: good. Let it shift. It is our time. The trucks became more than machines. They became rolling ambassadors. Every time one crossed a border, it carried a story of African dignity, of African determination, of a continent choosing to stand on its own feet. And inside the factory walls, plans accelerated. Not just more trucks, but buses, tractors, even prototypes of electric vehicles. The future was being drafted in African ink, on African desks, by African minds. What began as a single factory was becoming a continental spark. A fire that could ignite others. Proof that even nations with limited means could carve industrial pride out of dust and steel. For centuries, Africa was told its role: dig, extract, export. Leave the building to others. But now, in Ouagadougou, that script was being torn apart. The sound of engines on Sahel roads declared a new role: Africa as builder, Africa as creator. Africa as sovereign. And as more nations placed their orders, as more students enrolled in engineering, as more workers found dignity on factory floors, one truth grew louder: this was not just Burkina Faso's story. This was Africa's. But victories do not come without shadows. The trucks that rolled with pride across West Africa also rolled across the nerves of powerful interests far beyond the Sahel. Because for every truck built in Ouagadougou, there was a contract lost in Paris, a shipment reduced in Shanghai, a profit margin shrinking in Detroit. What seemed to be a local story of hope began to look, from foreign capitals, like a threat. Reports circulated quietly: Burkina Faso is disrupting supply chains. African manufacturers may destabilize global markets. Behind the language of analysis was fear that Africa, long contained in the role of raw supplier, was breaking free. Pressure followed. Development agencies questioned safety standards. International banks whispered doubts about financing. Foreign journalists wrote pieces suggesting the factory was unsustainable, that the trucks would never compete, that Africa was dreaming too big. It was not critique. It was strategy. Doubt is the sharpest weapon when bullets cannot be fired. And yet, inside the factory, the response was silence. Not weakness, but discipline. While articles mocked, engines roared. While analysts doubted, welders welded. While foreign voices spoke of impossibility, Burkinabe hands proved possibility. Still, the tension grew. Some governments in the region, influenced by external ties, hesitated to place orders. Lobbyists pushed foreign brands as safer investments. Aid packages were suddenly tied to procurement choices. The old chains of dependency tried to tighten again, disguised as assistance. But something had shifted. The people were no longer convinced by polished promises from abroad. They could see the trucks with their own eyes. They could touch them, drive them, repair them. Dignity is not abstract once it sits in your driveway. Sovereignty is not theory once it carries your harvest to market. And in that moment, the twist became clear. This was never just about vehicles. It was about narrative. Who tells Africa what it can be? Who writes the story of its limits? For centuries, that story was written elsewhere. But now, in the clatter of steel on steel, Africa was seizing the pen. Of course, the resistance will not vanish. There will be sabotage, misinformation, perhaps even covert attempts to slow progress. But history teaches that once an idea has taken root, no force can uproot it easily. The idea born in Ouagadougou was simple but unstoppable: we build. That simplicity terrifies those who profited from dependency. Because if one factory in Burkina Faso can spark regional change, what happens when 10 factories rise? When a corridor of industry stretches across the Sahel? When Africa stops exporting weakness and starts exporting strength? The twist is not that the world resists Africa's rise. That was expected. The twist is that Africa no longer asks permission. And with each truck that rolls into the dust, the message grows louder: the age of waiting is over. The age of building has begun. The trucks are more than machines. They are symbols. Symbols of a continent that refuses to be defined by the past, that dares to imagine a future on its own terms. In the dust of Ouagadougou, Africa has shown the world that sovereignty is not theory, it is practice, forged in steel, tested on roads, carried in the hands of its people. This is not just Burkina Faso's victory. It is a chapter in Africa's awakening. And the question now is not whether Africa can build, but how far it will go once it refuses to stop. If this story touches you, if you believe that what began in a single factory represents the heartbeat of a rising continent, then stand with it. Like, comment, share your voice below. And above all, subscribe, not just to this channel, but to the idea that Africa's future belongs in African hands. Because the age of waiting is over. The age of building has begun. And now, it is our turn to keep the fire alive, to carry the dream forward, to make sure the roar of engines never fades.